Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, a person ate something they probably shouldn't have. Maybe it was a berry, maybe it was a mushroom, maybe it was fermented fruit that had been sitting in the sun a little too long. Whatever it was, something happened to their brain that had never happened before. And instead of dying, which was the usual outcome of eating random things in the wild, they felt extraordinary. And then they told everyone. That moment, repeated across dozens of cultures on every continent, is the beginning of one of the longest and most universal stories in human history. The story of how your species discovered that the world was full of plants, fungi, and fermented liquids that could temporarily rewire the brain. Not accidentally, not recklessly, deliberately, systematically, and in many cases, reverently. Here is the part nobody puts in the history books. The discovery of mind-altering substances is not a story of weakness or stupidity. It is a story of curiosity. The same curiosity that built civilization, invented medicine, and eventually put a person on the moon was also responsible for the first human to look at a cactus and think, I wonder what happens if I eat the inside of that. The answer, for the record, was peyote. And the answer to what happens was apparently significant enough that indigenous cultures across the Americas built entire spiritual traditions around it that persist to this day. But let's go back further, much further. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional intoxicant use comes from alcohol. Not beer as you know it, not wine, something far more primal. Researchers excavating a cave in the Raqefet cave site in Israel found residue inside stone mortars dating back approximately 13,000 years. Analysis of the residue, published by a team led by archaeologist Li Lu of Stanford University, suggested early humans were deliberately fermenting grain-based beverages thousands of years before anyone thought to bake bread with the same grain. Let that sink in. Your ancestors figured out how to brew alcohol before they figured out how to make a sandwich. The leading theory is not that early humans stumbled onto fermentation by accident. The theory is that fermentation may have been one of the primary motivations for cultivating grain in the first place. In other words, the desire for a reliable supply of fermented beverages may have been a significant driver of agriculture itself. Humanity may have settled down, started farming, and built the foundations of civilization not because of bread, but because of beer. Somewhere a historian is having a very uncomfortable moment reading that sentence. Now, alcohol is just the beginning. Across the ancient world, humans were systematically discovering and cataloging substances that altered perception. Psilocybin mushrooms, the kind that produce hallucinations, appear in archaeological evidence and ancient art across multiple continents. Researcher Brian Murarescu, in his book The Immortality Key, spent years tracing evidence that psychoactive substances were used in ancient Greek religious rituals, specifically in a ceremony called the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was attended by some of the most famous figures in ancient history. Plato attended, Aristotle attended, Marcus Aurelius attended. Whatever they were drinking at those ceremonies, it was almost certainly not grape juice. The ancient world was, to put it gently, considerably more chemically adventurous than your school history class suggested. But why? Why did humans across every culture, on every continent, independently seek out and develop relationships with mind-altering substances? The answer comes from researcher and physician Andrew Weil, who proposed in his landmark work that the human brain has a built-in drive to experience altered states of consciousness. He called it a basic human appetite, as fundamental as hunger or thirst. Your brain, it turns out, gets bored of itself. It craves novelty. It seeks perspectives it cannot generate on its own. The altered state, whether through sleep, meditation, breath work, or a fermented beverage shared around a fire, offers the brain something it cannot produce from ordinary waking experience. And for ancient humans, these substances didn't just offer an escape, they offered something far more significant.
They offered explanation. When you live in a world without science, without medicine,
without any framework for understanding why the sun moves, or why people get sick, or why dreams feel so real. A substance that dissolves the boundary between the ordinary world and something that feels larger and more meaningful is not a recreational drug. It is a door. Ancient cultures didn't have the words psychoactive. They had words like sacred, holy, visionary. The shaman who consumed the peyote or the mushroom or the carefully prepared brew wasn't getting high in the modern sense. They were, in the framework of their culture, accessing a realm that ordinary consciousness could not reach, communicating with ancestors, receiving guidance, healing the sick. The earliest known human relationship with cannabis dates back approximately 2,500 years, documented in burial sites in the Jirzenkal Cemetery in western China. Researchers found wooden braziers, essentially ancient incense burners, with burnt cannabis residue inside them. The cannabis found at the site had a significantly higher concentration of THC than wild varieties, suggesting these were not accidental encounters with a plant that happened to be nearby. Someone had selectively cultivated it. Someone knew what they were doing. 10,000 years before your local dispensary, someone in ancient China was already optimizing the product. Here is the part that makes all of this genuinely strange. Every culture that developed a relationship with a psychoactive substance also developed rules around it. Rituals, restrictions, specific times, specific people, specific purposes. The substances were almost never used casually or individually in their original context. They were communal, ceremonial, controlled. The shaman used them. The initiate used them at a specific moment of transition. The community used them at specific festivals. The concept of a person sitting alone consuming something to numb the day would have been deeply strange to the cultures that first discovered these substances. Not because they were more disciplined, but because that wasn't what the substance was for. It was for connection to each other, to the unknown, to something larger than the ordinary self. What happened between that original context and the modern one is one of the more complicated stories in human history, involving colonization, industrialization, the severing of cultural context, and eventually prohibition. But that is a different video. The point is this. The impulse that drove your ancestors to taste the fermented fruit, to eat the mushroom, to brew the sacred drink, was not weakness. It was not escapism. It was the same impulse that drove them to carve flutes from vulture bone, to paint animals on cave walls, and to look up at the stars and ask what they were. It was curiosity. The stubborn, relentless, occasionally reckless human need to find out what is on the other side of ordinary experience. That impulse is still in you. You feel it every time you want to see what is around the next corner, read one more page, stay up later than you should, or eat something you probably shouldn't. The next time you are doing something you know you shouldn't be doing, and you find yourself unable to explain exactly why you were doing it anyway, remember this. You come from a very long line of people who ate the suspicious mushroom. And most of them were fine. Your brain just added something new. Something it won't forget. That's what this channel is for. One hidden truth at a time. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And if this made you think differently, drop it in the comments. See you in the next one.